Hey guys, tonight we're taking you back to ancient Rome, but not the sanitized Hollywood version you're imagining. Picture this. You wake up on a thin straw mattress in a cramped tenement building, sunlight streaming through a window that's just a hole in the wall. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of togas or marble columns, it's the smell. A nauseating cocktail of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and burning olive oil assaults your nostrils with the force of a freight train. Your modern nose, accustomed to air fresheners and daily showers, immediately goes into revolt mode. You're probably thinking you could tough it out, maybe adapt like people do when they travel to developing countries. Well, you probably won't survive this because ancient Rome wasn't just different, it was actively hostile to everything your pampered modern body considers normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how this little community spans the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You try to sit up, and immediately your back screams in protest. That straw mattress you're lying on, it's infested with fleas, bed bugs, and probably a few creatures that haven't been cataloged by modern science. The wooden bed frame creaks ominously under your weight, not because you're heavy, but because Roman furniture was built for people who averaged about 5 feet tall and weighed maybe 120 pounds soaking wet. Your modern diet of processed foods and growth hormones has made you a literal giant by their standards, and everything around you feels like it was designed for children. The noise level is absolutely incredible. Through those glassless windows, you hear the cacophony of a city that never sleeps. Merchants are already hawking their wares in voices that could wake the dead. Cartwheels are grinding against stone streets with the persistence of fingernails on a chalkboard, and somewhere in the distance, you can hear what sounds like a riot, but is probably just normal morning activity in the Subura district. Romans didn't believe in quiet residential neighborhoods. Commerce, industry, and living spaces were all mashed together in a chaotic urban stew that would make modern city planners weep. You stumble to your feet, and that's when you realize your first major problem. You're wearing your regular clothes, those comfortable cotton pajamas, or that soft polyester t-shirt. They mark you as either incredibly wealthy or completely foreign, neither of which is a safe thing to be in ancient Rome. Cotton was a luxury import that cost more than most people earned in a year, and synthetic fabrics simply didn't exist. Everyone around you is wearing rough wool or linen that looks like it could double as sandpaper, and their clothes are dyed in colors that look suspiciously faded and dirty by modern standards. The building you're in is a classic Roman insula, a multi-story apartment complex that's basically a death trap waiting to happen. The ground floor houses shops and workshops, while the upper floors where you find yourself are crammed with tiny apartments that make modern studio apartments look palatial. The stairs leading down are narrow, uneven, and slick with moisture that you really don't want to identify. There's no handrail, no emergency lighting, and definitely no fire escape. Historians still argue whether these buildings were intentionally built as fire traps or if that was just an unfortunate side effect of cheap construction and non-existent building codes. As you make your way toward what you hope is an exit, you encounter your first Romans of the day. They're small, dark-haired people with weathered faces and suspicious eyes. They chatter rapidly in Latin, but it's not the clean academic Latin you might have studied in school. This is street Latin, mixed with Greek loanwords, Germanic slang, and regional dialects that make it sound like an entirely different language. When they notice you staring, their conversations stop abruptly. In a society where strangers were automatically suspect and foreigners were either slaves, merchants, or invaders, your obvious confusion marks you as potential trouble. The woman nearest you, she's maybe 30 but looks 50 by modern standards, backs away slightly and mutters something under her breath. You catch the word barbarous, which even you know means barbarian. It's not exactly the warm welcome you might have hoped for. In ancient Rome, looking different wasn't quirky or interesting. It was dangerous. The empire was built on strict social hierarchies and cultural conformity, and anything that stood out was either enslaved, expelled, or eliminated. Your stomach chooses this moment to remind you that you haven't eaten, and the hunger pangs feel different here, more urgent, more desperate. That's because your body is already starting to realize that the easy calories and constant snacking of modern life are about to become distant memories. Romans ate differently, slept differently, and lived on a razor's edge of survival that your comfortable modern existence has left you completely unprepared for. The morning light streaming through the windows reveals the true scope of your predicament. This isn't a historical reenactment or a themed resort where you can tap out when things get uncomfortable. This is the real deal, ancient Rome in all its brutal, unforgiving glory. And you haven't even made it out of the building yet. Your stomach is growling with the intensity of a chainsaw, so you decide to venture out in search of food. Big mistake. What passes for breakfast in ancient Rome would make your modern digestive system stage a full-scale rebellion before you could swallow your second bite. You stumble down those treacherous stairs, past the suspicious neighbors, and emerge onto the streets where the first food vendors are already setting up their stalls. The smell hits you like a physical wall. It's not just that the food smells different, it's that everything about Roman cuisine is designed to assault your pampered taste buds and delicate stomach lining. That appetizing aroma you're detecting, it's garum, the Roman equivalent of ketchup, made from fermented fish guts that have been left to rot in the sun for several months. Romans put this stuff on everything, the way you might use salt or pepper, and they genuinely believed it was delicious. You approach the nearest food stall, operated by a gap-toothed man whose hands are already black with grime at this early hour. His selection looks like a medieval torture chamber's cafeteria. There are strips of meat hanging from hooks, and you really don't want to know what animal they came from, because Roman butchers weren't particularly picky about their protein sources. Rat, dog, and horse were all considered perfectly acceptable dining options, especially for the lower classes. The bread looks safer, so you point to a dark, dense loaf that seems relatively normal. The vendor breaks off a chunk and hands it to you, and you immediately realize your mistake. This isn't the soft, processed white bread your system is used to. This is Roman bread, coarse, gritty, and literally full of sand and small stones from the grinding process. Roman mills weren't precision instruments. They were just two big rocks smashed together, and whatever debris got mixed in was considered part of the nutritional value. Archaeologists have found Roman skulls with teeth worn down to nubs from a lifetime of eating this abrasive stuff. You take a tentative bite, and the texture is like chewing on concrete mixed with sawdust. The flavor is sour and bitter, nothing like the slightly sweet, pillowy bread you're used to. Your modern palate, trained on refined sugars and artificial flavors, recoils in horror. But it gets worse, much worse. The vendor is offering you something to drink, and your options are either wine that's been watered down to roughly the strength of modern beer, or water that comes from sources you absolutely don't want to think about. Roman water supply was actually quite advanced for its time, but advanced doesn't mean safe by modern standards. The lead pipes that brought water into the city were slowly poisoning everyone who drank from them, contributing to everything from mental illness to infertility. Historians still argue whether lead poisoning contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire, but there's no debate about whether it would mess with your modern system that's never been exposed to heavy metals as a dietary supplement. The wine seems like the safer option, so you take a sip and immediately regret it. Roman wine was nothing like the smooth, refined beverages you might enjoy at a dinner party. This stuff is harsh, acidic, and has a vinegar-like aftertaste that makes your eyes water. They often mixed it with honey, spices, and sometimes even seawater to make it more palatable. But palatable is a relative term when you're dealing with fermented grape juice that's been stored in clay pots for months without any real understanding of sanitation. You're starting to realize that even the most basic human need, eating, is going to be a nightmare in ancient Rome. Your digestive system, used to pasteurized milk, chlorinated water, and food that's been inspected by government agencies, is about to encounter bacteria, parasites, and toxins that would send you to the emergency room in modern times. Except there are no emergency rooms here, just folk remedies that are more likely to finish you off than cure you. The vendor is getting impatient, and you realize you haven't paid yet. This presents another problem. You don't have any Roman money. The coins in your pocket, if you even have any, are completely worthless here. Roman currency was based on the silver denarius and the gold aureus, and the exchange rate was tied to the actual metal content of the coins. Your paper money and credit cards are just colorful rectangles of plastic and paper that have no meaning in a society that hasn't invented banking as you know it. You try to explain your situation through gestures, but the vendor's expression is growing increasingly hostile. In ancient Rome, trying to take food without payment wasn't just theft, it was a serious crime that could result in slavery, brutal punishment, or death. The concept of running a tab or paying later didn't exist for foreigners and strangers, especially ones who looked as suspicious as you do. Other vendors and customers are starting to notice the commotion, and you're drawing exactly the kind of attention you want to avoid. In a society where public order was maintained through swift and brutal justice, being labeled a thief was essentially a death sentence. You back away from the stall, your stomach still growling, and realize that finding food is going to be much more complicated than you imagined. The irony isn't lost on you. Here you are in one of history's most advanced civilizations, and you can't even manage to eat breakfast without risking your life. This is just the beginning of a very long day. Your stomach might be empty, but your bladder is definitely full, and this is where your Roman adventure takes a turn from merely unpleasant to absolutely horrifying. You need to find a bathroom, but what Romans considered acceptable toilet facilities would make your modern sensibilities curl up and die. The concept of privacy, personal hygiene, and basic sanitation that you take for granted simply doesn't exist here in any form you'd recognize. You follow the increasing crowd of Romans through the narrow streets, hoping to spot something that resembles a public restroom. What you find instead is the Roman equivalent, a public latrine that looks like something from your worst nightmares. Picture a long stone bench with circular holes cut into it, positioned over a flowing channel of water that's supposed to carry waste away. There are no stalls, no doors, no privacy barriers of any kind. Just a row of holes where Romans sit side by side, conducting business and casual conversation as if they're at a coffee shop. The smell alone is enough to knock you unconscious. This isn't the chemically treated, ventilated restroom odor you might encounter at a gas station. This is raw human waste, urine, and decomposing organic matter all mixed together in a cocktail that would make a sewage treatment plant seem like a flower garden. Your modern nose, used to air fresheners and proper ventilation, immediately triggers your gag reflex so violently that you have to step back and breathe through your mouth. But the smell is just the beginning of your toilet trauma. Romans used communal sponges on sticks instead of toilet paper, the same sponges, shared by everyone, rinsed in a bucket of salt water between uses. The hygiene standards that would make these sponges acceptable by modern standards simply didn't exist. Bacterial infections, parasites, and diseases spread through these facilities like wildfire, and Romans just considered it part of daily life. You're standing there, desperately needing to relieve yourself, but absolutely unable to bring yourself to use this medieval torture chamber when you notice something even more disturbing. The Romans using these facilities aren't just conducting personal business, they're having full conversations, discussing politics, making business deals, and socializing as if sitting on a communal toilet was the most natural thing in the world. Privacy wasn't just rare in ancient Rome, it was considered suspicious and antisocial. Historians still argue whether Romans actually enjoyed these communal toilet experiences, or if they just accepted them as necessary, but there's no debate about the health consequences. Dysentery, cholera, and various parasitic infections were so common that they were considered normal parts of life. Your modern immune system, which has never encountered these ancient pathogens, would be completely overwhelmed within hours of exposure. You decide to try finding a more private option, but this presents its own set of problems. Wealthy Romans had private toilets in their homes, but these weren't much better than the public ones. They were still just holes that connected to the same sewage system, and they still used the same shared sponge technology. The main difference was that you didn't have to share your toilet time with strangers, though servants and slaves might still be present, because privacy was a luxury that even the wealthy couldn't fully achieve. The apartment building where you woke up definitely doesn't have private facilities. Most Roman insulae didn't include toilets at all, leaving residents to use chamber pots that were emptied into the streets or to make trips to the public latrines. The phrase, emptied into the streets, isn't metaphorical here. Romans literally threw human waste out of their windows, sometimes with a shouted warning to pedestrians below, but often without any warning at all. You're starting to realize that your modern concept of basic sanitation is completely incompatible with Roman life. The flush toilet, running water, soap, and toilet paper that you consider essential human rights simply don't exist here. Instead, Romans used olive oil to clean themselves, scraped it off with metal tools called strigils, and considered themselves perfectly clean by the standards of their time. Your bladder is becoming increasingly urgent, but your mind is rebelling against the available options. You could try to find a private corner somewhere, but public urination was actually illegal in Rome and could result in fines or punishment. You could attempt to use the public facilities, but the risk of disease, humiliation, and sensory overload seems almost unbearable. This is the moment when you realize that even the most basic biological functions are going to be a nightmare in ancient Rome. Your body's needs haven't changed, but the infrastructure to meet those needs is so primitive and disgusting that survival itself becomes questionable. And remember that breakfast disaster from earlier? Whatever you eventually manage to eat is going to have to come out eventually, and that's going to be an even more traumatic experience than what you're facing right now. The Romans around you seem completely oblivious to your distress. They're going about their morning routines as if sitting on communal toilets and sharing sponges is the most natural thing in the world, because for them, it is. You're the abnormal one here, with your strange expectations of privacy and sanitation. After your traumatic bathroom reconnaissance mission, you realize your clothing situation is becoming a serious problem. What seemed like a minor wardrobe issue this morning is now a matter of life and death. Every Roman you encounter stares at you with a mixture of suspicion, confusion, and outright hostility. And it's all because of what you're wearing, or more accurately, what you're not wearing according to their rigid social dress codes. Let's start with the obvious problem. Your modern clothes scream foreigner louder than if you had a neon sign flashing above your head. That cotton t-shirt you're wearing? Cotton was so expensive in ancient Rome that it was literally worth more than gold by weight. It was imported from India at enormous cost and was reserved for the absolute elite of Roman society. Wearing cotton casually would be like walking around modern New York in a shirt made of diamonds. People would assume you're either incredibly wealthy, completely insane, or that you stole it from someone important. Your jeans or casual pants present an even bigger problem. Romans didn't wear pants. They considered them barbaric garments worn by Germanic tribes and other uncivilized peoples. Roman men wore tunics and togas, while women wore long robes called stolas. Pants were so associated with barbarians that wearing them in certain parts of the city could get you arrested as a suspected enemy spy or runaway slave from the northern territories. The fabric of your modern clothes is also completely wrong. Romans wore wool and linen almost exclusively, both of which had very different textures, colors, and draping properties than your synthetic blends. Roman clothing was rough, scratchy, and came in a limited palette of natural dyes, mostly browns, grays, and muted earth tones. The bright colors and smooth textures of modern fabrics would mark you as wearing something that simply shouldn't exist in their world. But the real problem isn't just that your clothes look foreign, it's that they violate Roman social hierarchies in ways that could get you killed. Roman clothing was a complex system of social signaling that communicated your class, occupation, citizenship status, and wealth at a glance. Wearing the wrong thing wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It was a form of fraud that undermined the entire social order. Take the toga, for example. Only Roman citizens were allowed to wear togas, and different types of togas indicated different social positions. Senators wore togas with purple stripes, while ordinary citizens wore plain white ones. Wearing a toga when you weren't entitled to one was a serious crime, but not wearing one when you should have been could also get you in trouble. It was a catch-22 situation designed to keep everyone in their proper place. Your footwear is another dead giveaway. Those comfortable sneakers or boots you're wearing would be completely incomprehensible to Romans. They wore sandals made of leather, and the style of sandal indicated your social status, just like everything else. Military sandals were different from civilian ones. Slave sandals were different from citizen ones, and wearing the wrong type could result in accusations of impersonating someone you weren't. Historians still argue whether Roman clothing laws were strictly enforced or if there was some flexibility for foreigners and visitors, but the consensus is that standing out was dangerous. In a society built on rigid hierarchies and instant visual identification of social status, looking wrong could get you enslaved, arrested, or worse. You try to blend in by observing how other Romans dress, but this just makes the situation more confusing. The wealthy Romans you see are wearing elaborate garments with intricate drapery and expensive decorations, while the poor are dressed in rough, patched clothing that looks like it's been worn by 3 generations. There's no middle ground, no casual Friday option, no way to dress down or dress up to match different situations. The Romans around you are starting to mutter among themselves, and you catch fragments of conversation that don't sound friendly. Words like barbarous and service keep coming up, barbarian and slave. Your strange appearance is making people assume you're either an escaped slave, a foreign spy, or some kind of criminal trying to disguise your identity. A group of young Roman men approaches you, and their body language suggests this isn't going to be a friendly cultural exchange. They're pointing at your clothes and speaking rapidly in that street Latin you can't understand, but their tone is unmistakably aggressive. In ancient Rome, looking suspicious wasn't just socially awkward, it was an invitation for vigilante justice from citizens who saw themselves as protectors of public order. You back away slowly, but the damage is already done. Word is spreading through the crowd that there's a strangely dressed foreigner who might be up to no good. In a society without modern communication systems, rumors and gossip traveled with the speed of wildfire, and once you were marked as suspicious, that reputation would follow you everywhere you went. Your clothing, the comfortable, practical garments that make perfect sense in your modern world, has become a liability that threatens your survival in ancient Rome. Every thread, every seam, every design choice is broadcasting information about you that you don't even realize you're sending, and all of it is wrong. You decide to try communicating your way out of this increasingly hostile situation, but opening your mouth only makes everything infinitely worse. The moment you speak, every Roman within earshot stops what they're doing and stares at you like you just started speaking in tongues. Your modern pronunciation of Latin, if you even know any, sounds absolutely nothing like the way Romans actually spoke, and your attempts at English or any other modern language only confirm their worst suspicions about you. Here's the thing about Latin that your high school teacher never mentioned. The classical Latin you might have studied bears about as much resemblance to street Latin as Shakespeare does to modern texting. Romans spoke fast, clipped their endings, mixed in Greek words, used regional slang, and pronounced everything completely differently than the careful academic pronunciation you learned. What you think sounds like proper Latin pronunciation actually makes you sound like a pretentious foreigner trying to mock their language. But even if you could speak perfect classical Latin, you'd still be in trouble because Romans didn't all speak the same language. The empire was a multilingual nightmare where Latin mixed with Greek, Celtic, Germanic dialects, and dozens of local languages. In the streets of Rome, you might hear Aramaic from Syrian merchants, Egyptian from grain traders, Germanic languages from auxiliary soldiers, and Celtic from British slaves. Understanding what people were actually saying required not just language skills, but cultural context that took years to develop. Your accent immediately gives you away as a complete outsider. Romans could identify where someone came from just by listening to them speak for a few seconds. Regional accents were so distinct that they functioned like ancient ID cards, telling listeners not just where you were from, but what social class you belonged to and what kind of education you'd received. Your modern accent, whatever it is, doesn't match anything in their experience, which means you're either from some unknown territory or you're lying about your identity. The vocabulary you use makes the situation even worse. Modern languages are full of concepts that didn't exist in ancient Rome. Try explaining that you're from America or that you arrived by airplane, and watch Romans assume you're either insane or claiming to be some kind of god. Even basic modern concepts like weekend, privacy, or human rights have no equivalent in Latin because the ideas themselves didn't exist in Roman culture. You attempt to use hand gestures to communicate, but this backfires spectacularly because Roman gesture language was incredibly sophisticated and specific. What you think is a friendly wave might be an obscene insult, and what you intend as a peaceful gesture could be interpreted as a challenge to fight. Romans used their hands to communicate complex ideas, emotions, and social relationships, and getting it wrong was like accidentally cursing at someone while trying to say hello. The crowd around you is growing larger and more agitated. Someone shouts what sounds like a question, and when you don't respond appropriately, the mood shifts from suspicious to openly hostile. In ancient Rome, refusing to answer direct questions from citizens was considered both rude and suspicious. They're probably asking about your citizenship status, where you're from, and what you're doing in their neighborhood, all perfectly reasonable questions that you have no way of answering satisfactorily. Historians still argue whether Romans were generally tolerant of foreigners, or if xenophobia was the default attitude, but there's no debate about what happened to foreigners who seemed threatening or deceptive. Rome was built on the conquest and assimilation of other peoples. But that process involved clear rules about how foreigners should behave and integrate into Roman society. Breaking those rules, even accidentally, could result in slavery, expulsion, or death. You try pointing to yourself and saying your name, hoping to establish some basic communication, but your modern name sounds completely foreign to Roman ears. Roman names followed specific patterns that indicated family relationships, citizenship status, and social position. A typical Roman citizen had three names: a praenomen, nomen, and cognomen, and the combination told everyone exactly who you were and where you fit in society. Your single modern name suggests you're either a slave, a barbarian, or someone trying to hide their true identity. The language barrier isn't just preventing communication, it's actively making you seem more dangerous and suspicious with every word you speak. In a society where verbal skills were considered essential marks of civilization, your inability to communicate properly marks you as fundamentally uncivilized and potentially threatening. A Roman, in what looks like an official capacity, pushes through the crowd toward you. He's speaking in rapid, authoritative Latin that you can't understand, but his body language suggests this is some kind of interrogation. He's probably asking about your citizenship papers, your business in Rome, and your intentions. Romans took bureaucracy seriously, and foreigners were expected to have proper documentation and reasons for being in the city. You stand there mute, unable to answer his questions, and watch his expression grow increasingly stern. In ancient Rome, silence wasn't golden, it was suspicious. Your inability to provide satisfactory answers to basic questions is marking you as either a criminal, a spy, or someone with something to hide. The official questioning you is growing more impatient by the second, but your real problem isn't just that you can't answer his questions, it's that you don't understand the massive social hierarchy that governs every interaction in Roman society. Everything about how you're standing, where you're looking, and how you're responding is broadcasting that you have no idea how Roman social structure works, and that ignorance is about to get you into serious trouble. Roman society was built on a rigid class system that made medieval feudalism look flexible and egalitarian. At the top were the senators and patricians, followed by the equestrian class, then regular citizens, then freedmen, and finally slaves at the bottom. But within each of these broad categories were dozens of subcategories, each with their own rules, privileges, and restrictions. Your modern brain, trained to think in terms of rough equality and individual merit, simply cannot process the complexity of this social maze. The way you're standing right now, upright, making direct eye contact, not immediately deferring to the official's authority, suggests that you think you're his social equal or superior. In Roman terms, this means you're either a high-ranking citizen who should be able to prove your status, or you're a rebellious slave who needs to be reminded of your place. Since you clearly can't prove the former, everyone is assuming the latter. Your modern concept of personal dignity and individual rights is completely incompatible with Roman social expectations. You instinctively resist bowing, scraping, or showing the kind of immediate deference that Romans expected from their social inferiors. This resistance isn't just rude, it's dangerous. Romans maintained social order through a complex system of mutual obligations and displays of respect, and disrupting that system was considered a threat to civilization itself. The crowd is watching this interaction with growing interest because public confrontations were a form of entertainment in ancient Rome. Social hierarchy was constantly being tested, challenged, and reinforced through these kinds of public displays, and everyone present understands the rules of the game except you. They're waiting to see whether you'll be revealed as a fraud, a criminal, or just an ignorant foreigner who doesn't know his place. Romans identified social status through hundreds of subtle signals that you're completely oblivious to. The way someone walked, spoke, gestured, and even stood communicated their position in society. Wealthy Romans moved with confident authority. Slaves kept their eyes downcast, and everyone in between found their own appropriate level of deference or dominance. Your modern body language doesn't fit any of these patterns, making you seem like a social anomaly that threatens the natural order. The official is now speaking to other Romans in the crowd, probably asking if anyone recognizes you or knows your background. In ancient Rome, strangers were automatically suspect because everyone was supposed to be connected to the social network through family, patron-client relationships, or professional associations. Being completely unknown wasn't just unusual, it was practically impossible unless you were a runaway slave, a foreign spy, or a criminal fleeing justice. Historians still argue whether Roman social mobility was more or less fluid than medieval European systems, but there's no debate about the consequences of being caught outside the established hierarchy. People who couldn't prove their social position were assumed to be slaves until proven otherwise, and slaves who pretended to be free citizens faced brutal punishment, including torture, crucifixion, or being thrown to wild animals in the arena. You're beginning to realize that your modern assumption that you deserve basic respect and fair treatment simply because you're human is completely foreign to Roman thinking. In their world, respect was earned through social position, which was determined by birth, wealth, political connections, and legal status. Without any of these credentials, you're essentially nobody, less than nobody actually, because at least official nobodies like slaves had owners who could vouch for them. The crowd is growing restless, and you can sense that this situation is about to escalate beyond mere questioning. Romans believed in swift justice, and if they concluded that you were a threat to public order, they wouldn't hesitate to deal with you immediately. Mob justice was common and generally considered acceptable as long as it reinforced proper social hierarchies. A well-dressed Roman woman approaches the official and speaks quietly in his ear. She keeps glancing at you with an expression that suggests she's sharing some theory about your identity or intentions. In Roman society, women from wealthy families often had significant informal influence, and their opinions carried weight in social matters. Whatever she's telling him, it doesn't look like it's going to improve your situation. Your complete ignorance of Roman social protocols is making you seem not just foreign, but actively dangerous. In a society where everyone knew their place and behaved accordingly, someone who didn't follow the rules was either mad, criminal, or plotting something subversive. There was no category for confused time traveler in Roman social thinking. The official makes a gesture that causes several other Romans to step forward, and you realize that this interrogation is about to become something much more serious. Your failure to understand and respect Roman social hierarchy hasn't just made you unpopular, it's marked you as a potential enemy of the state. You decide that discretion is the better part of valor and attempt to escape this increasingly dangerous situation by fleeing into the labyrinthine streets of Rome. This turns out to be possibly the worst decision you could have made, because Roman streets weren't designed for casual strolling or quick getaways. They were designed to funnel people, goods, and traffic through the city in ways that would absolutely destroy your modern sensibilities and probably your physical body as well. The moment you step into the main thoroughfare, you're hit by a wall of sensory overload that makes your earlier experiences seem pleasant by comparison. The noise level is absolutely incredible. Cartwheels grinding against stone, merchants shouting at the top of their lungs, animals braying and squealing, and thousands of people talking, arguing, and conducting business all at the same time. Romans didn't believe in quiet zones or noise ordinances. The city operated at full volume from dawn to dusk, and anyone who couldn't handle it was considered weak or antisocial. The streets themselves are a death trap waiting to happen. Roman roads were built for durability, not comfort, which means they're paved with large, uneven stones that would challenge a mountain goat. Your modern shoes, designed for smooth pavement and level surfaces, provide absolutely no traction on these slick, worn stones. Every step is a potential ankle-twisting disaster, and you're already stumbling like a drunk person trying to navigate an obstacle course. But the real danger comes from the traffic. Roman streets were filled with carts, wagons, pack animals, and pedestrians, all moving in different directions, with no traffic rules whatsoever. Drivers didn't yield to pedestrians. If anything, pedestrians were expected to get out of the way of commercial traffic. A loaded cart pulled by oxen or mules had the right of way over everything else, and those drivers weren't particularly concerned about running down anyone stupid enough to block their path. You dodge a cart carrying what looks like enormous clay pots full of olive oil, only to nearly get trampled by a group of slaves carrying a wealthy Roman in a litter. The litter bearers are moving at a steady trot, and they expect everyone to clear the path immediately. Failing to show proper deference to wealthy Romans in transit wasn't just rude, it was a punishable offense that could result in a beating or worse. The air quality is absolutely brutal. Romans burned everything: wood, charcoal, oil, and various organic materials that produced thick, choking smoke. Combined with dust from the constant construction and renovation projects, animal waste from the hundreds of horses and oxen in the streets, and the general lack of any pollution control, the air is thick enough to cut with a knife. Your modern lungs, used to relatively clean air and indoor filtration systems, immediately start protesting with coughing fits that make you an even more obvious target. Historians still argue whether Roman urban planning was advanced for its time or if it was just controlled chaos, but there's no debate about the hazards of navigating ancient city streets. Pedestrian casualties were common and generally considered part of urban life. If you got run over by a cart or trampled by a crowd, it was your own fault for not being careful enough. The streets are also filled with vendors, beggars, pickpockets, and various other characters who see a confused foreigner as an opportunity. Street crime in ancient Rome was rampant and largely unpoliced. The urban cohorts and vigils were more concerned with major crimes and fires than with protecting individual citizens from theft or assault. If someone robbed you, cheated you, or attacked you, you were basically on your own, unless you had powerful friends or enough money to make it worth pursuing. You're trying to move quickly through the crowd, but your modern concept of personal space is completely incompatible with Roman street life. Romans were used to being packed together like sardines, touching strangers, and having no buffer zone around their bodies. Your instinctive flinching and backing away from physical contact marks you as either germophobic or antisocial, both of which were considered character flaws in Roman culture. The smells are getting worse as you move deeper into the commercial district. Every shop, workshop, and food stall produces its own unique aromatic assault. Tanneries processing leather with urine, blacksmiths burning coal and metal, food vendors cooking with rancid oil, and the ever-present background aroma of human and animal waste all combine into an olfactory nightmare that would make a garbage dump seem fragrant by comparison. You realize you're completely lost within minutes of leaving the main street. Roman neighborhoods weren't laid out in neat grids with street signs and addresses. They were organic mazes that had grown over centuries, with narrow alleys, dead ends, and confusing intersections that could trap unwary visitors forever. Without GPS, street maps, or even basic directional signs, navigation required local knowledge that took years to develop. The crowd behind you seems to be following, and you can hear shouting that doesn't sound friendly. Word has spread about the suspicious stranger, and now you're not just lost, you're being hunted through streets that you don't understand by people who know every shortcut, dead end, and hiding place in the neighborhood. Your panicked flight through the Roman streets has left you exhausted, confused, and desperately in need of work to survive. But the Roman job market is about to deliver another crushing blow to your modern expectations. You stumble into what appears to be a commercial district where people are conducting business, hoping to find some kind of employment that might help you blend in and earn enough to eat. What you discover instead is that Roman work culture would literally kill you before lunchtime. The first thing you notice is that everyone around you is already working at a pace that would violate every labor law ever written. Roman workers started before dawn and continued until well after dark, with no concept of 8-hour days, weekends, or mandatory breaks. The idea that work should be balanced with leisure time was completely foreign to Roman culture, where productivity was measured by how much you could accomplish before your body gave out entirely. You approach what looks like a construction site, where workers are moving massive stone blocks using nothing but ropes, pulleys, and human muscle power. The foreman, a scarred man with arms like tree trunks, looks you up and down with the expression of someone evaluating livestock. He barks something in Latin that you don't understand, but his gestures make it clear he's asking about your experience with heavy labor. Your soft, modern hands immediately give you away as someone who's never done serious physical work. Romans could tell at a glance whether someone was accustomed to manual labor, and your smooth palms and uncalloused fingers mark you as either wealthy, lazy, or completely inexperienced. The foreman's expression shifts from evaluation to dismissal, and he waves you away like you're a bothersome insect. But let's say he did hire you for a day of construction work. Roman building techniques required workers to lift, carry, and position stones that weighed hundreds of pounds using primitive tools and techniques that relied almost entirely on human strength. Your modern body accustomed to power tools and mechanical assistance, would be completely overwhelmed within the first hour. The combination of physical exertion, heat, and lack of safety equipment would likely result in serious injury or death before the morning was over. You try the marketplace next, hoping to find something less physically demanding. Roman commerce was conducted at a pace and intensity that would make modern retailers look relaxed. Merchants worked from dawn to dusk, haggling over every transaction, managing complex trade relationships, and keeping track of inventory using nothing but their memories and crude accounting methods. The mental strain of conducting business in a pre-literate society where everything depended on personal relationships and oral agreements would exhaust your modern brain within hours. The vendors you observe are dealing with customers who expect to negotiate every price, question every product, and conduct business relationships that extend far beyond simple buying and selling. Roman commerce was embedded in complex social networks where your reputation, family connections, and political relationships all affected your ability to make a living. As a complete outsider with no connections and no understanding of local customs, you'd be cheated, robbed, or simply ignored by potential customers. Historians still argue whether Roman working conditions were better or worse than those in other ancient civilizations, but there's no debate about the physical and mental demands placed on workers. Life expectancy was short, partly because work was so dangerous and exhausting that most people's bodies simply wore out by what we would consider middle age. You consider trying to find work as a teacher or scribe, thinking your modern education might be valuable, but this presents its own set of impossible challenges. Roman education was based on memorizing classical texts, rhetorical techniques, and cultural knowledge that you simply don't possess. Your ability to read and write in modern languages would be completely useless in a society where literacy meant mastering Latin and Greek literature, not just basic communication skills. The few Romans who made their living through intellectual work were expected to quote classical authors from memory, compose poetry in complex meters, and engage in sophisticated debates about philosophy, politics, and literature. Your modern education, however advanced, simply doesn't include the cultural knowledge that Romans considered basic intellectual qualifications. Even if you could find some kind of work, Roman employment relationships were nothing like modern jobs. There were no contracts, no guaranteed wages, no worker protections, and no legal recourse if your employer decided not to pay you. Most work was arranged through personal relationships and family connections, and breaking into established networks as a complete outsider was nearly impossible. The physical demands of Roman work were compounded by the complete lack of safety regulations or medical care for workplace injuries. If you hurt yourself on the job, you were on your own to deal with the consequences. Roman medicine for treating work-related injuries was primitive at best and often made things worse rather than better. You're standing in the marketplace, watching Romans conduct business with an energy and intensity that makes your modern work life seem leisurely when you realize that even finding employment would require social connections, cultural knowledge, and physical capabilities that you simply don't possess. The Roman workday would break your body, exhaust your mind, and leave you worse off than when you started. Your failed attempt to find work has left you not only exhausted, but also nursing what feels like a pulled muscle in your back from trying to lift a single stone block. In the modern world, this would be a minor inconvenience that you'd treat with over the counter pain medication, ice, and maybe a visit to urgent care. In ancient Rome, this minor injury is about to become a potential death sentence because Roman medical care would be more likely to kill you than cure you. The concept of evidence based medicine simply didn't exist in ancient Rome. Instead, Roman physicians operated on a combination of superstition, primitive anatomical knowledge, and treatments that were often more dangerous than the original ailment. Your sore back would be diagnosed through a system that balanced the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and treated with methods that would make medieval torture seem humane by comparison. You hobble toward what appears to be a medical practitioner's shop, recognizing it by the various herbs, surgical instruments, and anatomical models displayed outside. The physician, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and an expression of supreme confidence, examines you with the thoroughness of someone who's never heard of the scientific method. He pokes, prods, and asks questions in rapid Latin while making notes on a wax tablet. His diagnosis process involves checking your pulse, examining your urine, and feeling for various lumps and bumps that supposedly indicate the state of your internal humors. The fact that you can't communicate your symptoms properly only makes him more confident in his assessment, because Roman medicine was more art than science, and physicians were trained to trust their intuition over patient input. The treatment he prescribes for your back pain would make you long for the days when you only had to worry about language barriers and social hierarchies. First, he wants to bloodlet you using a bronze blade that looks like it hasn't been cleaned since the Punic Wars. The theory is that your pain is caused by excess blood creating pressure in your system, so removing a few pints should provide immediate relief. The fact that this will leave you weak, dizzy, and more vulnerable to infection doesn't factor into his medical reasoning. If bloodletting doesn't work, he's prepared to try cupping, a procedure that involves heating small clay pots and placing them on your skin to create suction. The goal is to draw out the evil humors that are causing your pain, but the actual result would be painful burns and blisters that would take weeks to heal. Roman physicians were convinced that the more dramatic and painful the treatment, the more effective it was likely to be. For more serious cases, Roman medicine included procedures that would make modern patients faint just from the description. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, using instruments that were rarely sterilized by practitioners who had only the most basic understanding of human anatomy. Historians still argue whether Roman surgical techniques were advanced for their time or if they were just elaborate forms of torture, but there's no debate about the survival rates. Most surgical patients died from the treatment rather than the original problem. The medicines available in ancient Rome were a fascinating combination of genuinely helpful herbs and substances that were actively poisonous. Your Roman physician might prescribe willow bark, which actually does contain compounds similar to modern aspirin, but he's just as likely to recommend lead-based compounds, mercury preparations, or exotic animal parts that would cause more problems than they solved. Roman dental care was particularly horrifying. Toothaches were treated by drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits, pulling teeth with crude forceps, or applying caustic substances that burned away infected tissue along with healthy tissue. The concept of preventive dental care was completely unknown, and most Romans simply accepted tooth loss as an inevitable part of aging. Mental health treatment in ancient Rome was even more primitive than physical medicine. Depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions were attributed to supernatural causes and treated with exorcisms, bloodletting, or confinement in conditions that would violate every human rights convention ever written. The idea that mental illness might have natural causes and effective treatments was centuries away from being discovered. Your modern immune system, which has been protected by vaccines, antibiotics, and sanitary living conditions, would be completely overwhelmed by the bacterial infections, parasites, and diseases that Roman medical treatment would expose you to. Even if the original treatment didn't kill you, the secondary infections from unsterilized instruments and unsanitary conditions probably would. The physician is growing impatient with your obvious reluctance to undergo his recommended treatments. In Roman culture, refusing medical advice was considered both foolish and impious, since illness was often viewed as punishment from the gods that could only be cured through proper medical and religious intervention. You back away from the medical shop, your minor back pain suddenly seeming much more manageable compared to the alternatives, but the physician is calling after you with what sounds like warnings about the consequences of ignoring proper medical care. In ancient Rome, untreated medical conditions were believed to worsen not just the patient, but also bring bad luck to the entire community. Your escape from the medieval torture chamber, masquerading as a medical clinic, brings you face to face with another aspect of Roman life that would absolutely destroy your modern sensibilities: religion. You can't walk more than a few steps in ancient Rome without encountering shrines, temples, religious processions, or citizens performing rituals that are completely incomprehensible to your secular modern mindset. What makes this dangerous is that Roman religion wasn't just personal belief, it was mandatory civic duty, and getting it wrong could mark you as an enemy of the state. The religious landscape of ancient Rome was incredibly complex, involving dozens of gods, goddesses, spirits, and supernatural forces that required constant attention and appeasement. Romans didn't just believe in their gods, they lived in daily fear of accidentally offending them through improper behavior, forgotten rituals, or inadequate offerings. Your complete ignorance of these religious requirements is like walking through a minefield blindfolded while juggling dynamite. You stumble into what appears to be a religious procession, honoring some deity you can't identify. The participants are carrying elaborate statues, burning incense, and chanting in unison while moving through the streets with the kind of solemnity that suggests this is serious business. Your modern instinct is to step aside and watch respectfully, but this turns out to be exactly the wrong response, because Roman religious ceremonies required active participation from all citizens present. A priest notices you standing on the sidelines and approaches with an expression that suggests you've just committed a major social error. He's speaking rapidly in Latin and gesturing toward the procession, clearly expecting you to join in the ceremony. Your reluctance to participate isn't just rude, it's potentially blasphemous, because Romans believed that the gods required unanimous community support for their rituals to be effective. The problem is that you have absolutely no idea what you're supposed to do. Roman religious ceremonies involved specific gestures, words, and actions that had to be performed correctly, or the entire ritual could be invalidated. Getting the details wrong wasn't just embarrassing, it could anger the gods and bring disasters down on the entire community. Romans took their religious responsibilities so seriously that they would repeat entire ceremonies from the beginning if anyone made a mistake. You try to follow along by copying what other people are doing, but this backfires spectacularly because Roman religious participation required understanding the meaning and significance of each action. Your clumsy attempts to mimic the other participants only make it more obvious that you don't belong there. The priest's expression shifts from expectation to suspicion, and other participants are starting to notice that something is wrong. Roman religion was deeply intertwined with politics and social identity. The gods weren't just supernatural beings to be worshipped. They were the divine protectors of the Roman state, and proper religious observance was considered essential for maintaining the empire's power and prosperity. Citizens who failed to participate properly in religious ceremonies were viewed as potential traitors who might bring divine punishment down on everyone. The situation gets worse when you accidentally make what appears to be an inappropriate gesture during a particularly solemn moment in the ceremony. Roman religious rituals were full of symbolic actions that had specific meanings, and using the wrong gesture at the wrong time could be interpreted as mockery, blasphemy, or even cursing. The crowd's reaction suggests that you've just done something deeply offensive. Historians still argue whether Romans were generally tolerant of religious diversity or if conformity was strictly enforced, but there's no debate about the consequences of disrupting official ceremonies. Religious crimes were taken very seriously and could result in exile, imprisonment, or execution, depending on the severity of the offense and the political climate at the time. You're trying to back away from the increasingly hostile crowd when you make another critical error. You fail to show proper respect to a statue of the emperor that's part of the religious procession. Roman emperor worship wasn't optional. It was a fundamental requirement of citizenship that demonstrated loyalty to the state. Ignoring imperial religious symbols was considered treason, punishable by death. The priest is now speaking to what appears to be a government official who was observing the ceremony. Romans didn't separate church and state the way modern societies do. Religious and political authority were completely intertwined, and religious crimes were often treated as political offenses. Your religious ignorance has now become a matter of state security. You realize that remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from your morning misadventures would seem like a minor inconvenience compared to the religious and political crisis you've just created. Roman religion required not just belief, but active, informed participation in complex ceremonies that took years to learn properly. The crowd is growing more agitated, and you're hearing words that even your limited Latin vocabulary recognizes as threats. In ancient Rome, religious criminals weren't just punished by the authorities. They were often attacked by angry citizens who believed that tolerating blasphemy would bring divine retribution on the entire community. Your modern concept of religious freedom and separation of church and state is not just foreign to Roman thinking, it's actively dangerous. In a society where religious conformity was considered essential for political stability and divine protection, your ignorance has marked you as a threat to everything Romans held sacred. Your religious blunders have attracted the attention of Roman authorities, and now you're about to discover that the Roman legal system makes modern bureaucracy look like a model of efficiency and fairness. The official who witnessed your ceremony disruption is gesturing for you to follow him, and refusing isn't really an option because Roman law enforcement operated on the assumption that innocent people cooperated willingly while only criminals tried to flee. Roman justice was based on principles that would horrify any modern person who believes in due process, presumption of innocence, or basic human rights. The legal system was designed to maintain social order and protect the interests of the state, not to ensure fair treatment for individual defendants. Your modern expectations of legal representation, trial by jury, and protection against self-incrimination simply don't exist in any form that you would recognize. You're marched through the streets to what appears to be a government building where legal proceedings take place. The architecture is impressive, lots of marble columns and official-looking decorations. But the atmosphere feels more like a military tribunal than a court of law. Romans conducted legal business with the efficiency of people who considered justice a tool for maintaining order rather than protecting individual rights. The magistrate who will hear your case is a wealthy Roman citizen who combines judicial, executive, and administrative powers in ways that would violate every principle of modern legal systems. He's not just a judge, he's a political appointee who represents the interests of Rome and has the authority to make decisions based on what he thinks is best for the state, rather than what's technically legal or fair. Your case is presented by the priest and the government official who witnessed your religious infractions. But their testimony isn't just about what you did, it's about what your actions reveal about your character, intentions, and potential threat to Roman society. The concept of limiting testimony to specific factual evidence doesn't exist in Roman legal proceedings. Character assassination, speculation about motives, and guilt by association are all considered perfectly legitimate legal arguments. The magistrate listens to the accusations against you while taking notes on a wax tablet, but he's not really interested in your side of the story because Roman legal procedure assumed that officials and citizens were more trustworthy than foreigners and suspected criminals. Your inability to speak proper Latin, your strange appearance, and your obvious ignorance of Roman customs all count as evidence against you in a system that valued conformity and social stability above individual rights. You try to explain your situation through gestures and the few Latin words you know, but this only makes things worse because Roman legal proceedings required formal rhetoric and proper legal language. Your clumsy attempts at communication are interpreted as either disrespect for the court or evidence that you're trying to deceive the authorities. In Roman law, how you presented your case was often more important than the actual facts of your situation. Historians still argue whether Roman legal procedures were advanced for their time or if they were just organized systems of oppression, but there's no debate about the outcomes for people who couldn't navigate the system properly. Foreign defendants, poor citizens and anyone without powerful connections were routinely convicted regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. The magistrate is asking questions that you can't understand, but your failure to provide satisfactory answers is being recorded as evidence of guilt. Roman legal theory held that innocent people had nothing to hide and would eagerly cooperate with authorities, while only criminals would be evasive or uncooperative. Your obvious confusion and inability to communicate are being interpreted as signs that you're guilty of something serious. Roman punishment for religious crimes and social disruption could range from fines and public humiliation to exile, slavery, or death, depending on the magistrate's assessment of how dangerous you were to public order. The specific punishment wasn't necessarily related to the specific crime. It was based on what Roman authorities thought would best serve as an example to others and maintain social stability. The proceeding is moving quickly because Roman justice prioritized efficiency over thoroughness. Long trials were considered wasteful and potentially disruptive to public order, so magistrates were expected to make decisions quickly based on the available evidence and their judgment about what was best for Rome. You realize that the Roman legal system isn't designed to determine your guilt or innocence. It's designed to process you efficiently and dispose of your case in whatever way best serves Roman interests. Your individual rights, personal circumstances, and actual intentions are completely irrelevant to a legal system that views justice as a tool for maintaining imperial power. The magistrate is reaching for what appears to be an official seal, suggesting that he's ready to pronounce judgment on your case. Roman legal decisions were final and immediate. There were no appeals processes, no lengthy deliberations, and no second chances for defendants who were found guilty of crimes against the state. The sun begins its descent toward the 7 hills, and you realize with growing dread that you've somehow survived this long in ancient Rome, though survived might be too generous a word. Your stomach churns from whatever passed for lunch, your feet bleed through your inappropriate footwear, and you're pretty sure that rash spreading up your arm isn't just from the scratchy tunic you managed to acquire. But now, as the wealthy Romans begin their evening rituals, you're about to discover that Roman entertainment isn't exactly Netflix and chill. You stumble into what appears to be a gathering at a wealthy patrician's villa, drawn by the sounds of laughter and music. Maybe, you think desperately, this will be like a modern cocktail party. Some wine, some small talk, maybe someone who speaks enough Latin to help you figure out where you're supposed to sleep tonight. You couldn't be more wrong. Roman evening entertainment makes modern reality TV look like a meditation retreat. The first shock comes when you realize the entertainment involves watching actual gladiatorial combat, not in the Colosseum, but right here in the courtyard. A wealthy Roman has hired a few retired gladiators to put on a show for his guests, and the blood spattering the marble tiles is very, very real. You try to look away, but that's immediately noticed by your host, who assumes you're either a coward or showing disrespect. Neither assumption will help your life expectancy. But wait, it gets worse. The Romans have a concept called spectaculum, which basically means that everything is designed to be watched, judged, and commented upon. You're not just observing the entertainment, you are part of it. Every reaction you have, every flinch, Every inappropriate gasp becomes fodder for the crowd's amusement. Your modern sensibilities about violence, your obvious discomfort with the casual cruelty, your inability to cheer at the right moments, all of this marks you as an outsider, possibly even a threat to Roman values. The drinking games alone would probably kill you. Romans didn't just drink wine, they had elaborate social rituals around alcohol consumption that could last for hours. There's the symposium tradition, borrowed from the Greeks, where philosophical discussion mixes with increasingly heavy drinking. You're expected to contribute witty observations about politics, philosophy, and literature in Latin naturally, while consuming wine that's probably 3 times stronger than anything you're used to. Miss a cultural reference, mispronounce a philosopher's name, or fail to understand a political joke, and you've just announced to everyone that you're either poorly educated or completely foreign. Historians still argue whether Roman dinner parties were genuinely intellectual affairs or just elaborate excuses for social networking and showing off. But either way, you're failing spectacularly. The Romans valued wit, verbal sparring, and the ability to make clever references to literature you've never read. Your attempts at humor fall flat, partly because of the language barrier, but mostly because Roman comedy relied heavily on class-based insults, political satire, and cultural knowledge you simply don't possess. The musical entertainment presents its own challenges. Roman music sounds nothing like what you're expecting, with strange instruments producing unfamiliar scales and rhythms. When someone hands you a lyre and expects you to contribute to the evening's music, your fumbling attempts produce sounds that convince everyone you're either mentally deficient or deliberately mocking their cultural traditions. Both interpretations put you in serious danger. Then there's the matter of Roman games and gambling. These aren't friendly poker nights. They're serious social affairs where Romans bet everything from money to slaves to political favors. Your obvious confusion about the rules, your inability to calculate odds using Roman numerals, and your shocked reaction when someone literally bets another human being's life on a dice roll, all combine to make you the evening's most uncomfortable entertainment. The sexual politics of Roman entertainment would leave you completely bewildered and probably traumatized. Roman attitudes towards sexuality were completely different from modern Western norms, with practices and expectations that would shock contemporary sensibilities. What Romans considered normal evening entertainment often involved activities that would be considered highly inappropriate or even illegal in modern society. Your obvious discomfort with these situations would mark you as a prude, a foreigner, or worse, someone who doesn't understand Roman values about pleasure, power, and social hierarchy. As the evening progresses, you realize that Roman entertainment isn't just about having fun. It's about displaying social status, testing loyalty, and reinforcing the complex web of relationships that hold Roman society together. Every game, every joke, every shared experience is loaded with meaning you can't possibly understand. You're not just failing to be entertained, you're failing a series of social tests that determine whether you're worthy of Roman citizenship, Roman friendship, or even Roman tolerance. The violence, the excess, the casual cruelty, the impossible social expectations. By the time the evening's entertainment concludes, you're either thoroughly traumatized, completely drunk, or both. And this was just the appetizer for what Romans considered a proper social evening. As the evening's violent entertainment winds down and the last gladiator limps away to tend his wounds, you think maybe, just maybe, the worst is behind you. After all, how much more could possibly go wrong in one day? You're about to discover that Roman dinner parties aren't just social gatherings. They're elaborate theatrical productions where every guest plays a role, follows unwritten scripts, and navigates social landmines that could destroy reputations or even lives. Welcome to the most dangerous meal of your existence. Your host announces that dinner is served, and you follow the other guests into the triclinium, the formal dining room that looks nothing like any restaurant you've ever seen. There are no chairs, no familiar tables, just low couches arranged around a central space where servants will place the food. You watch in growing panic as the other guests gracefully recline on their left sides, propping themselves up on their elbows in positions that look comfortable for them, but would probably give you permanent back damage within minutes. Your attempt to copy their posture results in an awkward sprawl that immediately identifies you as someone who's never attended a proper Roman dinner party. The seating arrangement isn't random. It's a complex social map that reflects everyone's status, relationships, and political affiliations. Where you sit determines not just what food you'll receive, but how much respect you'll be shown, which conversations you'll be allowed to join, and whether you'll leave this dinner with your reputation intact. Unfortunately, nobody explained the seating chart to you, and your confused wandering around the room looking for a place to sit has already offended several important people and probably violated at least 3 unwritten social rules. When the first course arrives, you realize that Roman dining customs are designed to separate the civilized from the barbarians, and you're definitely falling into the latter category. Romans don't use forks. They eat with their hands, but there's an entire etiquette system governing which fingers to use, how to clean them between courses, and what gestures are appropriate versus insulting. Your clumsy attempts to pick up food result in dropped items, stained clothing, and horrified stares from your fellow diners. What you think is just trying to eat without making a mess, they interpret as either profound ignorance or deliberate rudeness. The food itself presents a series of challenges that would probably defeat you before the main course arrives. Romans loved exotic flavors, unusual combinations, and ingredients that would turn your modern stomach inside out. That appetizer that looks relatively safe, it's dormice stuffed with honey and poppy seeds. The sauce that everyone's praising, it's garum, made from fermented fish entrails and considered the height of culinary sophistication. Your obvious revulsion at these delicacies marks you as having an unrefined palate, basically the Roman equivalent of showing up to a wine tasting and asking for beer. But the real minefield isn't the food, it's the conversation. Roman dinner parties are where politics gets discussed, business deals get made, and social alliances get forged or destroyed. You're expected to contribute witty observations, demonstrate your knowledge of current events, and navigate the complex web of who supports which political faction. Your ignorance of Roman politics, your inability to recognize important names, and your shocked reactions to casual discussions of slavery, conquest, and political assassination make you a liability to anyone who might have considered befriending you. Historians still argue whether Roman dinner parties were genuine social gatherings or elaborate performance spaces where every word was calculated for maximum political impact. But either way, you're failing the test. The Romans valued intellectual discourse, but their idea of stimulating conversation includes topics that would horrify modern sensibilities. When someone asks your opinion on the latest military campaign, you can't just say you haven't been following the news. That would suggest you're either too poor to matter or too stupid to understand politics. The drinking rituals at dinner are even more complex than the earlier entertainment. Romans mixed their wine with water in specific ratios that vary depending on the occasion, the season, and the social status of the participants. Getting the mixture wrong isn't just a minor faux pas. It suggests you don't understand Roman values about moderation, sophistication, and proper behavior. Your attempts to skip the wine entirely are interpreted as either an insult to your host or evidence of some shameful personal weakness. As the evening progresses, the conversations become more intimate, more dangerous, and more loaded with implications you can't possibly understand. Romans used dinner parties to test loyalties, spread gossip, and gather intelligence about their rivals. Every casual comment might be a probe to determine your political affiliations. Every seemingly innocent question could be an attempt to gather information that might be used against you later. Your honest, straightforward responses to these conversational traps mark you as either incredibly naive or potentially dangerous. The servants moving silently around the room aren't just bringing food, they're observing everything, remembering every word, and reporting back to various masters about what they've seen and heard. Your inability to recognize this network of household spies, your casual treatment of people the Romans consider property, and your obvious discomfort with the entire system of slavery that makes this dinner possible all contribute to making you the most memorable guest of the evening, and not in a good way. By the time the final course arrives, you've committed so many social blunders that your reputation in Roman society is essentially destroyed. You've offended your host, confused your fellow guests, and probably violated several laws you didn't even know existed. The dinner that was supposed to be a pleasant social evening has become a comprehensive demonstration of why you don't belong in Roman civilization. The dinner party finally ends, and you stumble out into the Roman night, thinking that surely, you can find somewhere safe to sleep, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning. You couldn't be more wrong. As darkness falls over the 7 hills, Rome transforms from a challenging daytime obstacle course into something that resembles your worst nightmare. The city that barely tolerated you during daylight hours becomes actively hostile once the sun disappears, and you're about to discover why most Romans, with any sense, barricaded themselves indoors after sunset. First, there's the complete absence of street lighting. When we say Rome goes dark, we mean Egyptian tomb, can't see your hand in front of your face dark. The only illumination comes from occasional torches carried by people wealthy enough to afford both the torch and the slave to carry it, or from flickering oil lamps in windows, assuming the residents haven't shuttered everything tight against the night's dangers. Your modern eyes, accustomed to streetlights, neon signs, and the gentle glow of electronic devices, are completely useless in this prehistoric darkness. You're essentially blind, stumbling through narrow streets that were challenging enough to navigate in daylight. The sounds of nighttime Rome would probably drive you to madness within hours. Without the daytime noise of commerce, politics, and social activity, you can suddenly hear everything else. The screams echoing from buildings you can't identify, the sound of running feet that might belong to criminals fleeing a crime scene, the crash of pottery that could indicate anything from a domestic dispute to a full-scale riot. Every noise seems amplified and threatening, and your modern brain, trained to associate nighttime with relative safety and quiet, goes into permanent panic mode. But the real terror begins when you realize you're not alone in these streets. Nighttime Rome belongs to a completely different population than the daytime city. The criminals, the desperate, the violent, and the genuinely insane all emerge after dark, turning the streets into hunting grounds where your chances of survival drop to nearly zero. Your obvious foreignness, your valuable modern dental work, and your complete inability to defend yourself make you the perfect target for every predator in the city. Roman law enforcement, such as it is, essentially disappears after sunset. The vigils, Rome's combination police force and fire department, are spread impossibly thin across a city of over 1 million people, and they're more concerned with preventing fires than protecting individual citizens from crime. If someone decides to rob you, assault you, or worse, there's no one to call, nowhere to run, and no expectation that justice will ever be served. You're completely on your own in a city where violence is considered a normal part of daily life. The homeless population of Rome emerges at night like some kind of urban plague. These aren't the relatively organized homeless communities you might know from modern cities. These are people who've been cast out of Roman society entirely, many of them former slaves, failed gladiators, or citizens who've lost everything to debt or political persecution. They're desperate, they're dangerous, and they view anyone who appears to have anything worth taking as a potential source of survival resources. Your modern clothes, your obvious confusion, and your apparent wealth make you a walking advertisement for easy prey. Historians still argue whether Roman knights were genuinely as dangerous as contemporary sources suggest, or whether the wealthy Romans who wrote most of our historical records simply exaggerated the threats to justify their own comfortable seclusion. But either way, you're experiencing the reality rather than the historical debate. The narrow streets that seemed merely inconvenient during the day become death traps in the darkness, with countless alleys, doorways, and blind corners where attackers can hide. The religious dimension of Roman knights adds another layer of terror to your situation. Romans believed that darkness brought out supernatural threats as well as human ones, spirits of the dead, angry gods, and various monsters that modern people would dismiss as superstition, but that every Roman knew were real and dangerous. Your inability to perform the proper protective rituals, your ignorance of which gods to pray to for safety, and your obvious skepticism about supernatural threats mark you as someone who's spiritually defenseless against the forces of the night. Even if you somehow avoid human predators and supernatural threats, the physical dangers of nighttime Rome would probably finish you off. The streets are full of obstacles, invisible in the darkness: broken pavement, open sewers, construction materials, and waste that's been dumped from upper-story windows. One wrong step could send you tumbling into a drainage ditch, impale you on a piece of discarded metal, or dump you into a pool of human waste that would probably kill you from infection even if the fall didn't break your neck. The temperature drops significantly after sunset, and your inappropriate clothing provides no protection against the cold, damp night air. Romans understood the importance of proper night clothing, but you're still wearing whatever you manage to acquire during the day, if you manage to acquire anything at all. Hypothermia becomes a real threat, especially if you can't find shelter, and your modern body, accustomed to climate control and appropriate seasonal clothing, begins shutting down in conditions that Romans would consider merely uncomfortable. As you stumble through the darkness, trying desperately to find somewhere safe to wait for dawn, you realize that even if you survive the next few hours, you'll face the same challenges again tomorrow night and the night after that, for as long as you remain trapped in this ancient nightmare. The Rome that seemed merely difficult during the day reveals its true nature after dark, a predatory urban jungle where your survival depends on knowledge, connections, and skills you simply don't possess. The hours crawl by like wounded animals, each minute stretching into an eternity as you huddle in whatever pathetic shelter you've managed to find. Maybe a doorway, maybe an abandoned cart, maybe just a pile of refuse that offers some protection from the wind. Your body shakes uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the accumulated trauma of experiencing a world that seems designed specifically to destroy you. Every shadow could hide a killer, every sound could signal your doom, and you begin to understand with crystal clarity why this single day in ancient Rome will almost certainly be your last. The pre-dawn hours bring a special kind of horror as your modern mind, accustomed to the safety and predictability of contemporary life, finally begins to break down completely. You've spent less than 24 hours in this ancient world, and already your psychological defenses are crumbling. The constant fear, the overwhelming sensory assault, the complete inability to communicate effectively or understand basic social rules, it all combines into a mental collapse that would probably require years of therapy to recover from, assuming you somehow survived to receive it. Your body is failing just as dramatically as your mind. The contaminated water you've been forced to drink has already begun its destructive work on your digestive system. The unfamiliar bacteria, the parasites, the toxic substances that Romans considered normal parts of daily life, they're systematically poisoning you from the inside out. Your stomach cramps have evolved into something that feels like someone's twisting a rusty knife in your intestines, and you're losing fluids from both ends at a rate that's rapidly approaching life-threatening dehydration. The infections are spreading too. That small cut you got from stumbling in the street has become an angry red wound that's begun streaking up your arm, a clear sign that sepsis is setting in. Without antibiotics, without proper wound care, without even basic antiseptics, your immune system is fighting a losing battle against bacteria that wouldn't even be considered dangerous in the modern world. What should have been a minor injury is becoming a death sentence, and you can feel your strength ebbing away with each labored heartbeat. But perhaps the cruelest realization is that even if you somehow survived the infections, the poisoning, the violence, and the exposure, you would face the same impossible challenges tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day thereafter. There's no learning curve steep enough to help you adapt to this world. The cultural knowledge required for basic survival would take decades to acquire, assuming you lived long enough to acquire it. The language skills, the social connections, the practical knowledge of Roman technology and customs, none of it can be learned quickly enough to save you. The social isolation would probably destroy you even if everything else didn't. Humans are social creatures, and you've spent an entire day unable to form meaningful connections with anyone around you. Every interaction has been marked by suspicion, confusion, or outright hostility. You're completely alone in a crowd of 1,000,000 people, and that loneliness cuts deeper than any physical pain you've experienced. The Romans around you aren't just strangers, they're aliens from a completely different world, and you're the alien in theirs. Historians still argue whether time travel would even be theoretically possible, but they're remarkably consistent in their assessment that anyone from the modern era would face insurmountable challenges in adapting to ancient civilizations, and Rome represents perhaps the most extreme example of this incompatibility. The gap between modern and ancient life isn't just technological, it's psychological, social, and spiritual. You're not just lacking the right tools, you're lacking the right mind. As the first gray light of dawn begins to creep across the eastern sky, you realize that you haven't actually survived your day in ancient Rome. You've merely delayed your inevitable destruction. Your body is shutting down, your mind is fragmenting, and your spirit is broken beyond repair. The sunrise that should bring hope instead illuminates the full scope of your hopeless situation. The sounds of the city beginning to stir again fill you with dread rather than relief, because you know that the new day will bring fresh horrors, new challenges, and new ways for this ancient world to demonstrate your complete inadequacy. The merchants opening their shops, the slaves beginning their morning duties, the free citizens preparing for another day of Roman life. They all move with a confidence and competence that you'll never possess. Your final coherent thought, as consciousness begins to slip away and your body finally surrenders to the accumulated damage of just one day in ancient Rome, is a profound appreciation for the miracle of modern civilization. Indoor plumbing, antibiotics, electric lighting, democratic government, human rights, religious tolerance, scientific medicine, all the things you took for granted now reveal themselves as precious achievements that represent thousands of years of human progress and suffering. The Rome that seemed so glorious in history books, so fascinating in documentaries, so romantic in movies, has revealed its true face, a brutal, unforgiving world where survival depends on knowledge, skills, and social connections that take lifetimes to develop. You came to ancient Rome as a tourist and discovered you were actually prey. As your breathing becomes shallow and your vision blurs, the chaos of the waking city fades into a gentle hum. The harsh voices of merchants calling their wares soften into distant whispers. The acrid smoke from cooking fires transforms into wisps of memory, drifting away like clouds at sunset. Your body, which has fought so valiantly against impossible odds, finally finds the peace it has been seeking since dawn. The cobblestones beneath you no longer feel cold and unforgiving. They become as soft as silk, cradling you like the most comfortable bed you've ever known. The morning light, which seemed so harsh and revealing just moments ago, now bathes everything in a warm, golden glow that makes even this ancient world appear beautiful and serene. Your last sensation is not of pain or fear, but of a profound quietness, a settling over everything, like the gentlest snowfall. The sounds of Rome fade to nothing more than a peaceful lullaby, the kind of soft background noise that helps you drift into the deepest, most restful sleep. Your eyelids grow heavy, not from exhaustion, but from a kind of perfect contentment, as if you're finally returning home after the longest, strangest journey imaginable. Sleep comes not as an ending, but as a gentle transition into dreams, where indoor plumbing works perfectly, where every meal is safe and familiar, where darkness brings comfort instead of terror, and where you are surrounded by people who speak your language and understand your world. In these dreams, hot showers exist, antibiotics cure every infection, and no one expects you to navigate impossible social hierarchies or survive without the countless modern conveniences that make life not just possible, but genuinely beautiful. Rest now, dear listener. Let the soft hum of your fan carry you away from ancient Rome and back to the safety of your modern world, where tomorrow will bring familiar challenges that you're perfectly equipped to handle. Sweet dreams.